Well, I feel like it was a good idea to fit in the brief question period at the end of the first talk, because I thought it would give helpful direction to the second one. It would actually confirms what I wanted to do anyway. And the questions indicated, with it asking about the history of science and the God of the gaps argument and the idea that the view is widespread that science began to get somewhere or knowledge began to improve when the thinkers started assuming that natural processes can explain everything, that nature is a closed and self-enclosed system that leaves God effectively out of the picture. It's starting with that investigative principle. In philosophy of science, it's called methodological naturalism. That enabled knowledge to be so successful. So then the argument would be we don't want to depart from that. That is a very important thing to consider. When I read from the beginning of the Gospel of John, the last two verses I read, after the ones identifying the Word as the Creator, said this: "In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it or has not overcome it." Now, I think that this scriptural statement is very much related to the problem of knowledge and what assumptions enable you to get valid new knowledge. See, now think about what light is. You're in a dark cave, imagine, and you're lost in a dark cave, and somebody brings a flashlight in. Say some rescuer appears. Now, the first thing is that you can see the light. The light is something that you can see in the darkness. And that in itself is encouraging. Maybe even just very faint. It's encouraging. There is some light there. But so far, the light hasn't done very much. See, because the important thing about light is not that you can see the light, but that because of the light, you can see everything else. So it's when the light begins to illuminate the rest of the cave that you have something really important. Then you can see, how to get out of your hopeless spot, how to come back to life. Right? That's the light. Now, the naturalistic doctrine of knowledge, the one that governs the research and teaching in the universities and down through them to the public schools and so on, that's taken for granted, is related to that. Because the metaphysical naturalist, the metaphysical materialist, the one who wishes to defend the authority of a science based on natural causes to explain everything, you see, will say, your John 1 through 14 passage, your prologue, the Gospel of John, isn't about light. What you say is the light is really the darkness of superstition. See, it was when it was superstition, it was through ignorance that people thought that God had done things, that people thought that the Word had done the creating. Knowledge began to come when we realized that was not the light, but was the darkness. The light came when we assumed that nature is effectively all there is. You see, that nature is a closed system of material causes and effects that cannot be influenced from outside. That's when we began to learn how life actually originated, through chemical evolution. That's when we learned how it grew to its present complexity through Darwinian evolution. You see, so the light was the principle of materialism, of naturalism. The darkness was the superstition of your word. And it is this understanding that accounts for why Christian theism, or theism in general, has been effectively excluded from the whole realm of knowledge. See, it doesn't belong there. It's a remnant of the darkness. And that's why you would study religious studies, study religious belief from a naturalistic perspective. But you would never see it as a source of knowledge. It doesn't give light. Now, if that is the case, then I think we would agree, wouldn't we, that the theistic principle of in the beginning was the Word deserves to be marginalized and excluded from the world of knowledge. That any reliance on that as a starting point would only lead us into error, confusion, and further darkness. See, so that's not the flashlight that's going to get you out of the cave. It's the principle of naturalism that is. And so that then would account for why we have a culture in which it's thought that it's okay for you to have religious beliefs in areas where scientific knowledge does not extend. You see, into how you feel about things, your personal feelings or your personal ideas about right and wrong, the purpose of life. Those are all matters of subjective preference. And so it's okay to have religious beliefs about those things. But they must never interfere, they must never intrude into the world of knowledge, say, which is where we rely on material and natural causes. So this inquiry, which I began to make in that long ago sabbatical in England, begins by saying, well, is that really true? You see, it isn't so much a matter of does God exist? You know, some people are content to say, well, they haven't proved that God doesn't exist, and so our religion is safe. Well, a God whose only role is that his absolute non-existence can't be conclusively proved is not much of a platform to rest your weight on, is it? Richard Dawkins likes to say, you're right, we can't prove God's non-existence, and we also cannot prove that there is not a teapot in orbit around the planet Pluto. And your God is right out there with that imaginary teapot. So the question is it the light that illuminates the world and leads to further knowledge? Now, I'll just start off. When I first began to study these things, my wife was a little bit worried that maybe I was getting in over my depth. We went to a bookstore in London. We were browsing, and she picked up a book called Isaac Asimov's Guide to Science. And she started reading about evolution. And she read, had a brief description of the Darwinian theory of evolution. Then 3 pages of denunciation for creationists, for being wicked people who didn't believe in the theory. Well, they had plenty of space to indulge his passions. And then a couple of paragraphs of proof of the theory, which amounted to the peppered moth story. And she wrote that, she said, I think you're on to something. Well, after that, I published the material of the book that later became Darwin on Trial in 1991, which really launched me into a career and raised the doubts. And I began to get connected with a whole body of people who were quite thrilled by the book and who had long wished to launch a scientific inquiry that got away from the Bible versus science stereotype. You see, that got away from those issues that seemed like a deadlock debate that could never go anywhere, and that put the discussion on a basis that actually could have an impact in the world of knowledge and bring out the most important issues that are in debate. You see, when you put it in terms of the book of Genesis and in the Bible science, the argument is about what's your source of information. Are ancient documents like Genesis a source of information that can compete with or trump, the findings of empirical research? And that's an issue that the culture is pretty much settled on the answer to. That's pretty much an issue that can't go anywhere. But I now raise the issue of putting aside those stereotype questions and those Genesis questions. What does the evidence of science tell us? And is it possible that the mainstream evolutionary scientists have been doing what they accuse the creationists of doing? You see, which is going to a source outside science to get their information. And that's the outside the data. That's the crucial importance of the 2 definitions concept as leading to an investigation. Now, of course, the scientific elite will give you all sorts of reasons for why they should stick to the second definition. You see why that's the good way, and we heard some of that, and you'll always hear this. If we don't do that, then people will just say, well, God did it, and they'll drop all questions. They won't do scientific research anymore, or we'll go back to pre-scientific conditions, or somehow it will prevent us from investigating things properly. It would be a disastrous thing to do. Well, now, I can answer all of those arguments. I think it would actually be good for science to eliminate all restrictions on considering what inferences you may draw from the data. And I think it's actually what many biochemists, many molecular biologists manage to do, even within the materialist paradigm. That is, they consider information and intelligence and so on as part of their discipline for practical purposes, even though they deny its existence. when dealing with the popular world. But no matter what the truth is about those matters, the point I really want to make is that in a sense it doesn't matter, because these questions go far beyond the professional interests of scientific researchers. You see, regardless of what biologists or other scientists think the assumptions they should make for the purposes of their discipline, that cannot possibly be conclusive for what all the rest of us in the world should think is the truth. And to say that, well, God can't be real because it's convenience for us in our, for our professional research purposes, getting grants and solving problems and all of that, to assume God out of existence. Therefore, all the rest of you should do that too, because it's convenient for us. That's a non-starter. That doesn't make any sense at all. So I want to know whether the Creator really is real. See, in the beginning was the Word. Is that real or is that imaginary? Now, the only way you can approach that as an intellectual problem, is to challenge the authority of the scientific materialists who say, in the beginning was the particles, has been conclusively proved, and say, well, is that your philosophy speaking or your data? I say, you have to press that inquiry, don't you? I mean, and even if you think the data can prove in the beginning was the particles, I should think intellectual honesty requires you saying that's a legitimate inquiry. Do the data prove it, or is it the philosophy that we're starting with? And so if we suspend definition number 2, if we say we're not going to assume that material causes always exist, that natural causes always exist, we're going to look at the data, then what do we discover? Now, I find there's a fierce resistance to doing that. It's just a ferocious resistance. And in proposing this in the academic world, often in the Christian world and so on, I often have to deal with a lot of anger. You see, it's not only irrational, it's immoral, it's evil to make that inquiry. But of course, that tells you something, doesn't it? As one of my friends like to say, when you're getting a lot of flack, you're over the target. When you find that ferocious self-protective mechanism, you know that there's a vulnerability to be exposed. And so now I started out with part of the vulnerability. The kind of things that I dealt with in my first book were the inadequacy of the observed instances of natural selection, the peppered moth, the finch beaks, mosquitoes becoming resistant to DDT, and so on, as showing only back and forth cyclical variation in fundamentally stable types, no permanent change at all, and certainly no innovation, no new organs, no new mechanisms appearing. Things don't grow wings or sprout eyes or whatever out of any of this, or even seem to be starting to do anything of that kind. It might continue over a long period of time. And then one of the things that first attracted my attention, and that of many others, was the controversy in the 1980s over the sensational debate among fossil experts over the theory called punctuated equilibrium. I tell you why that had such an impact. It's not really what the promoters of the theory were saying. It's the problem that they uncovered by proposing a solution. It's not the solution, it's the problem. Two famous fossil experts, Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard and Niles Eldredge of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, said that it was time to deal honestly and candidly with the problem that the fossil record failed to show the patterns of gradual progressive change that Darwinian evolution required. And so they proposed a theory. I'm going to cover it just very briefly because I say the theory itself is not the interest here, that evolution occurred primarily in small populations that went off in a corner somewhere, accumulated mutations, and then came back fully changed, So it seemed to happen very suddenly when it was really a gradual process. It was quick only in geological time, and so on. Well, reading about this and the sensation it caused in the fossil world, it piqued many of our interests because we had all been taught throughout our education, that the fossil evidence conclusively proved Darwin's theory and fully complied with all Darwinian explanations. And Gould, on the other hand, stated in his provocative language that the absence of that very evidence, the absence of the transitional fossils, was the trade secret of paleontology. Those words had a sensational effect, and Gould has been much criticized by people within the Darwinian world for uttering them. Because when you begin to hear that a body of knowledge like that has a trade secret, You see, and in fact, the situation is the opposite from what they have been representing it to the public as for many decades. It's time to audit the books. It's time to look. And what I saw about the fossil record, again, to cover this briefly in the time available, was that Gould and Eldridge were experts in the area where the animal fossil record is most complete. That is, marine invertebrates. Particularly, Eldridge studies trilobites. There are lots of trilobite fossils. And the reason for this is that when, let's say a bird or a human or an ape or a wolf or whatever dies, or even a fish, normally it does not get fossilized. It decays. It's eaten by scavengers, or it decays, say, in the open. Things get fossilized when they get covered over quickly with sediment so that they're protected from this natural destructive process. So if you want to be a fossil, the way to go about it is to live in the shallow seas, you see, where you're apt to get covered over with sediment when you die, if that's your ambition. So most of the animal fossils are of that kind. And it is in that area where the fossil record is most complete that there is a consistent pattern of variation. I mean, there is evolution in the sense of variation, just like in the peppered moth example and all, that things do vary, but they vary within the type. The new types appear suddenly fully formed without an evolutionary history, and then they stay fundamentally stable with variation thereafter. A sudden appearance and stasis were the two empirical observations that Gould and Eldridge made. Well, now, you see, I was aware, of course, that a number of examples of evolutionary intermediates were cited, and this was brought up as soon as people began to make the connection and question the profession about their theory in the light of this controversy. But the examples of claimed evolutionary transitionals, oddly enough, come from the area of the fossil record where fossilization is rarest, you see, where it's least likely to happen. Archaeopteryx would be the primal example. It's a bird, and so we expect it rarely to be fossilized, and yet it's been exhibit number one, you see, in the Darwinian case. So there's nothing else around it, you see, unlike with those marine invertebrates. And so you can tell a story of progressive evolution that might not work out at all if you saw, see the whole body of things around it. I mean, likewise with the ape men and so on. You see, that's another area where fossilization is very rare, and where the bones of apes and humans are rather similar anyway. So you find a variant ape bone, it's pretty easy to give a story about how it's turning into a human being. And if you tell the story well enough and successfully, you get your picture on the cover of National Geographic and you become rich and famous. And this could affect your judgment. In fact, one of the things that amused me is that there are so many candidates, fossil candidates, for human ancestorship. And so very, very few that are candidates to be ancestors of the great apes. The gorillas and orangutans. There should be just as many. But why not? Well, any economist can give you the answer to that. Human ancestors have a greater market value. And so they are produced at a much greater rate. These also were grounds to be suspicious of what was going on, that there was obviously so much subjectivity. And you see, the standard explanation for why the fossil record isn't more supportive of the Darwinian expectations than it is, if you find that out at all, is that fossilization is incomplete. There's so few fossils. I mean, most things aren't fossilized. The fossil record has many gaps. Not the theory has many gaps, but the fossil record has many gaps. You see, and yet that is odd if the problem is the greatest where the fossil record is most complete, you see, and if the confirming examples are found where fossils are rarest, that doesn't sound like that could be the explanation. So these kinds of skeptical arguments sort of began a process of investigation. But my objective was never just to be a one-man show writing books, expounding my ideas. I like to say that most people who've taken up this subject have wanted to, produce a body of writings that answers all the questions. Here's what the Bible says, here's what science says, here's what's true, here's what's false, and any question you ask, the authority can answer, on all of these things. And if you want answers to all the questions, you can definitely get them. You can go to the young Earth creationists. They'll give you one set of answers. You can go to the old Earth creationists. They'll give you a different set. You can go to the scientific materialists, and they'll give you a different set. So whatever answers you want, you can get them. And if you don't like those answers, you can go elsewhere and get a different set. Now, I didn't have that kind of an ambition. My ambition was not to answer all the questions. I have much more modest ambition. It was to create a worldwide cultural revolution that would totally overthrow the existing paradigm of knowledge. And in order to achieve this modest goal, you see, you have a different way of proceeding. That the important thing is to go directly to the heart of the problem, the heart of the enemy encampment, as it were, and blow up the ammunition dump. And to stick to the most fundamental question. And that most fundamental question is, can you really do the creating without a creator? Can natural processes really do this? We can afford to leave unanswered for now such questions as just what the history was and patterns of relationships and did one thing somehow by some mysterious process get transformed into another? All those interesting questions for down the road. But the big thing is, do you have this natural process that can do the job of creating? Everything else depends on that. Darwin himself said that. It was the first substantive point he makes in The Origin of Species. That if you don't have a mechanism, basically, you've got nothing. That, of course, isn't the way he put it. It's in Victorian prose, but that was the thought. Well, so then a movement begins to coalesce, the intelligent design movement. And we develop a strategy, as I call the wedge strategy, which the way this works is that my work is the sharp edge of the wedge. In the metaphor, the log that you're trying to split is the materialist understanding of knowledge. You see, the scientific naturalist philosophical system. And in order to split the log, which is in your way, imagine you're on a mountain road, you can't get past it, you can't go around it or whatever. The only way you can get ahead is to split the log. So you have to find a crack. And you have to find the weak point, and you have to drive a wedge into the crack. Now, the initial crack is the two definitions of science, you see, the separation between those. You want to separate those. And so I'm the sharp edge of the wedge, and then we have further thinkers broadening the wedge and developing a whole scientific movement. Now, dozens of books coming out. I'm going to tell you, about some of the starting points that are really getting going and the importance of it. So we begin by opening this question, and then the next person to enter as thickening the operations of the wedge was Michael Behe, B-E-H-E, a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University. Behe had become interested in these questions, and he was seminaring some of them with his graduate students. And he was offended by a piece that appeared in Science, which wasn't so much a review of my book, Darwin on Trial, as a personal attack on anyone who would do something so evil. And Behe wrote a letter in, and I got to know him because of that. I was, of course, glad to get any letter of support from a reputable scientist. And also turned out he writes the best letters to the editor of anyone I've ever met. He's a master of the genre. Does it really well. Well, Behe said, I'm beginning to see in my work as a biochemist, that everything that we're studying seems to deny this whole idea that a step-by-step mindless process of random variation and natural selection could create the kinds of things we're observing at the biochemical level. And he wrote his book, Darwin's Black Box, to exemplify that. It's a really excellent book. He did it awfully well because it's sort of like two books, one of which is written at the non-scientist level, at the general reader level. And then he has a lot of material in it that's sort of separated out, which is for people who have some background in biochemistry, because you really have to have both of them. If you don't have the technical matter, the scientists kill you. And if you have that all the way in, the other people can't read it. So you have to do something like that. He does it very well. Now, what Behe's central insight is it has to do with the cell. And the cell is a basic unit of a biological organism. A bacterium is a single cell. A human being consists, they say, of trillions of cells, which all work together in some marvelous harmony by some poorly understood coordinating mechanism. But never mind those trillions of cells, just think of the single cell. In Darwin's day, the cell was assumed to be a blob of protoplasm, something very simple that you can imagine emerging from the primal soup. Say it's nothing special, it's just like a blob of jello or something. But as the black box of Behe's title, the cell, has been opened. And we now see that it's a masterpiece of miniaturized complexity that can perhaps best be compared to a whole city. You see, a metropolitan area, I like to use this metaphor. You think of Boston, greater Boston with its subways, transportation systems, its energy generating system. It's the cellular repair machinery of the Mass General Hospital, and all of these things, enormously different, complex operations that are carried out under the direction of a supreme, controlling apparatus that brings it all together so that all these complex operations work together in marvelous harmony. Now, of course, there is where the analogy to Boston breaks down. But that's what the cell is like. And you find out that as Behe is describing this, the irreducible complexity, it's really what a lot of other scientists are seeing as well. That at the molecular level, you have, not this blob of protoplasm, but you have extraordinarily intricate levels of complexity. And most particularly, a mechanism in which you have many parts that have to work together and operate in very complicated ways on each other. Part 1 it interacts with 2 and 3 and 4, and then 4 repairs 1, and all around and about, so that the picture is where you need all of the parts to operate the system. Any one part on its own doesn't do anything useful. You see, it's only when they all come together. And that this is a consistent pattern. He gives many examples of irreducible complexity. As I say, the description is not really controversial. Many other scientists are describing the same thing. For example, there's a professor, James Shapiro at Chicago, who's interacted with us, who likes to say he has better examples of irreducible complexity than Behe does. And he will say that these things absolutely resist any explanation in the Neo-Darwinian terms, and you couldn't possibly rely on that to get to these things. And the idea that mutations change them, well, that's just what the cellular repair machinery prevents. It has intricate means for undoing the damage that the mutations are causing, and so on. And then at the end he says, but of course natural processes did it. We know that as scientists. Okay, so that's the kind of thing you get. Bruce Alberts, the president of the National Academy, who's a vehement materialist, has similar descriptions in his biochemistry book of irreducible complexity. But of course, everybody knows that natural selection did it anyway, because that's our best naturalistic explanation. So we know that as scientists. Definition number 2 comes in, you see, and trumps. So what's different about Behe's book is not any of the scientific description. It's that he puts aside definition number 2 and says, why don't we follow the evidence where it's going and say that given all of this irreducible complexity, you aren't getting any light from the Darwinian mechanism. You see, it's not explaining anything. It's like that idea of God that doesn't explain anything. It's something you can believe in, just say, well, it did it somehow, and then you can say, well, maybe parts were evolved for one purpose and then they were co-opted for a different purpose. And you see, you can make defensive, speculative explanations that give the credit to natural selection. But it isn't generating any light. It isn't illuminating anything. It's just something you're protecting from the facts, you say. So that's what made Behe's book unusual and extremely controversial. Now, you see, Behe doesn't deny evolution in a certain sense. He's tried, what exactly he believes may be a complicated subject, but he has tried to narrow his focus so that he doesn't take on more than is possible. And he says, I'm perfectly willing to believe that everything evolved from a single cell, if you like. But then that single cell must have contained all of the information, the directing processes that were required to construct everything else. I say, well, you might say, well, that's a kind of evolution. You see, but it isn't evolution as the scientific community understands the term, because it's obviously front-loading the whole mechanism with something that you can't explain as a product of the particles. It's allowing something else in, so he's denounced everywhere as a creationist. Behe is an illustration, by the way, of the ecumenical character of our movement. He's a Roman Catholic. And I like to say the real thing. 8 kids. homeschooled, so he's a terrific guy. You ought to hear him speak sometime. I'm sure he'll be available here at some point, and he's one of the greatest guys I've ever met. If you don't like Mike Behe, you just don't like people. Now, then second coming along in importance was William Dembski. Dembski with PhDs in philosophy and mathematics from University of Chicago and the University of Illinois. Publishes a book with Cambridge University Press. He's published a popular book with InterVarsity Press called called Intelligent Design. He has another book in press now called No Free Lunch, meaning that you can't get, complex information without a source of complex information. You can't, just have it grow itself. Dembski has rounded out the philosophical and mathematical arguments and concept of design. Now, let me tell you, just again, the basics of this story. I can't go into it adequately. There isn't time for that. And anyway, I don't have the bulging forehead that Dembski has. It's needed to do this accurately. He's really a remarkable guy. But the concept, the basic concept of information is not difficult to explain. You see, it is in that cellular machinery, what is the intricate program that coordinates it all? See, everybody's realized that such a thing must exist. Otherwise, it'd be chaos in the cell. Something is coordinating all of these complicated projects. And that's what Richard Dawkins means when he says the cell must be governed by a program with a database larger than all the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together. He says physics books may be complicated, but no physics book is anywhere near as complicated as a single cell in the brain of its author. And physics books don't write themselves, and random processes don't write physics books, and physical laws don't write physics books. You see, random processes give you chaos, give you disorder. Laws, chemical and physical laws, give you order. It's what we call simple repetitive order, the same thing over and over again. Like crystals, or it's like water. You put, H2 together with O and you get water. It's very boring, same thing all the time. Nothing, new happens, just water. It's important, it's good stuff, but, it's simple, repetitive procedure. That's what law does. But if you're talking about a complex text, the Boston phone book, if you like, the joy of cooking, or the operating system that coordinates your PC, then millions of lines of instructions, it's meaningful text. If you take a page of writing, anything will do to illustrate the example. What makes the arrangement of letters? See, it's the arrangement of letters that convey the meaning. Now, obviously, the arrangement of letters on a page is not explainable in terms of the chemistry that unites ink and paper. There are chemical laws which govern the uniting of ink and paper. But if they explained the order of the letters, then all books would be the same and very boring. So when you write a letter or a book, you're not violating any laws. You see, you're not violating the laws of chemistry. You're working through them. But you're adding something that's important. It's something that's indispensable to the message that couldn't be supplied by the laws themselves. That is called design. I say that's intelligence. And just as Windows 2000 needs an author, you see, the software engineers, and just as the Boston telephone book needs a team of authors, just as the plays of Shakespeare required an author, or even a humbler product like my own books, then the argument is that the controlling mechanism that controls all the operations of the cell must contain the same kind of complex specified information. It's complex in that it's long. It's specified in that the symbols have to be arranged in a certain way and no other way in order to get the product. You see, in order to get the computer program that works. So it's specified by the need to perform the function. And it's not mindlessly repeating and endlessly repeating, which it would be if it were produced by law. And you can just illustrate this. It's easy to produce a book that would be the equivalent of a book produced by physical law. Just program a macro in your word processor, write out the word law, L-A-W, again and again, until the printer runs out of paper. And you get a book. But it's a very boring book. And it never gets more interesting. Because the same law that gives you the minimal order you get prevents you from getting anything else. So law and chance working together work against each other. Chance gives you complex disorder, you see, and law gives you repetitive order. So if you mix the two together, you get the worst of both worlds. You do not end up with meaningful text. And so it's a common sense view that, you see, isn't mystical. It isn't referring to things that are ununderstandable by science. It's, in fact, referring to concepts that science uses everywhere, except where they're philosophically dangerous. See, except where they would lead people in dangerous directions of thought. So that when archaeologists view cave drawings, they have to be able to decide whether something that looks vaguely like an animal is really a drawing, you see, or whether it's a product of natural erosive forces. I gave a lecture recently in Phoenix, and look out the window, you know, and there's Camelback Mountain. Well, they say it looks like a camelback, but I never could see it. But clearly nobody thinks that some supernatural designer came down and made that to look like a camel. And so you can tell that that is the product of natural erosive forces. But if you look at Mount Rushmore, with the 4 presidents, you see a product of design, and you can tell the difference. What Dembski supplied was a complete mathematical and philosophical theory to explain how you know the difference and, you know, to quantify it in terms of probabilities. But we don't need to go into that. That's at the professional level. But I think most people are better off just understanding it at the common sense level. Now, is there something about science that requires you to exclude the concept of design? Well, now, you see, that would seem awfully strange to Bill Gates, wouldn't it? Actually, he doesn't understand the point, personally, so again, it's not a good example. He's confused about it. But, in fact, an engineer knows that science is design. It's designing things that work. That's why engineers are often, very receptive of this kind of talk. So scientists use the idea of design all the time, and things that are designed are not impenetrable black boxes that operate by mystical means that you can't investigate. And say, a computer's not a black box, it's something that operates by physical law, but it wouldn't operate at all unless there were a designer programming it. Now, our favorite example of design in scientific research comes from Carl Sagan and his SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Because, of course, Sagan was such a worldview promoter of the naturalistic worldview. But he was looking for signals from outer space, from space aliens. Now, you see, space aliens are different from God because Sagan wants space aliens to exist. And they'll give us better scientific, methods and so on, and rescue us from the religious fundamentalists in our midst and so on. So space aliens are good, and we want them to exist. So Sagan, gets the research money to set up these radio telescopes which receive signals from space. Now, most of them are just noise. That's random. They say that's a product of chance, meaningless, random. They might be complex patterns, but they're meaningless patterns. Then occasionally you get a regular pattern. I get excited about that. Is that a signal? No, it's a rotating pulsar. See, it's some regular astronomical pattern. And that's law generated. But then, well, nothing else has ever happened, but in the movie Contact, where Sagan wrote the script, you see, they got what they were looking for, and that was a set of prime numbers, a mathematical construct that wouldn't be produced by physical law. Numbers divisible only by themselves in 1. It's a purely intellectual idea. Say they were like 1, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17. Sometimes I make a mistake after that level. 21, it's a very big number for a lawyer. So then you recognize that as a signal from an intelligence. It must be, even though you have no corroborating evidence that such an intelligence exists. And that's the conclusion they drew, you see, in the movie. So, that's chance, law, and design. A simplistic I like to give, if I have a pair of dice here, I roll a dice, comes out double 6, that's chance. I roll it 100 times and it comes out double 6 every time, that's law. The dice are weighted. But the die themselves are designed. Nature doesn't produce something like that. So you can see this is a common sense concept. And if you apply the same logic to biology, see, the answer comes back. There's a design here. And then that doesn't end science. You study how, what the design is and how it works in the material medium, all the things that actually biochemists actually do study. And so you go on, you can go on studying them, but you understand what it is you're studying. It is a product of intelligence. And this is why they tend to use terms like engineering and information storage and translation of the genetic information from the 4-letter DNA code to the 20-chemical letter protein code. See, biochemists and molecular biologists talk this way all the time. They're really explicating design concepts. But then if you call them on it, they'll say, oh, it's just a metaphor. We don't mean it. That's what will be the answer. So Behe and Dembski then thicken the wedge by explicating this, by bringing molecular biology into it. Another book that I'm going to skip over briefly, but that I highly recommend, is Jonathan Wells's book, Jonathan Wells, Icons of Evolution. Icons of Evolution, because Wells goes in the most informative way through all the major textbook examples of evolution, like the peppered moth and the fossils, and shows you how some of them are outright scams, and others are exaggerations of very limited evidence. Others require question-begging assumptions, and none of them have any real probative validity at all. It's a really impressive book. And Wells, by the way, is another one of our double PhDs. He has a PhD from Yale, the Divinity School, and he has a PhD in developmental biology from Berkeley. So we're dealing with people who really know them stuff in the orthodox scientific literature and who are producing arguments which I consider very powerful and who are met, by the way, from the scientific community mainly with ad hoc denunciation, ad hominem denunciations. It's really, a scurrilous literature, a personal attack that tends to follow on arguing these concepts. But I'll go past Wells because it's really, mainly part of the negative evidence bit, rather than the building the case bit, although it's a very excellent job of that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but, I want to get on to another item that's coming out in the near future. It may have been published already. It's supposed to be out this month, but there have been a number of delays, so I'm a little hesitant. And this is a book by Paul Nelson, one of our chief workers, called On Common Design. Now, it is a modification of Nelson's PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago. Nelson is an outspoken creationist, and he managed to get a PhD from the evolutionary biologists at the University of Chicago, who, believe me, are not sympathetic to the case. But it's much to their credit that they allowed him to go through this. It's very exceptional. But he's an amazing person. It took him a dozen years to do it. And he wrote this dissertation on common descent. And the question presented in it on page 1 is, if the theory of universal common descent were false, how would we know it? All right. Now, the evolutionists have always insisted, the thing that they generally like to insist on, there's only one start of life, and then, see, all life proceeds from that one start. And the reason they like to do that is because the problem of how life gets started in the first place seems to be impossible. They aren't making any headway with it. But they think they've got it solved from that point through the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, has become so widely accepted. So that's the convenient way to do it. So it's very important that there be one ancestor of all living things. One of the reasons that Nelson was able to get this dissertation approved is that some of the scientists at Chicago think there must have been multiple starts, and that the problem of a single origin of life is so great that it's better to work with multiple origins. It's a question of which is the worst scenario. But in any event, what Nelson has done is shown through all the scientific literature what has happened with all of the attempts that have been made to try to change creatures, that is, to redirect the process of embryonic development by inducing mutations in the DNA. See, that's the whole Darwin idea. This is the mechanism, the modern Darwinian idea. Darwin himself didn't know about DNA, but the modern Darwinists do. And the idea is that it's changes in the DNA, mutations, that direct changes in the proteins and then in the organism. So that if you mutate the DNA, you should get the process of development from embryo to adult form, going in a different direction. And all sorts of efforts have been made to do that, and they have all been complete failures. As Nelson puts it, the last thing the organism wants to do is to evolve. And the embryo wants to get to its preordained starting point. And so when you induce the mutations, you may kill it. You may damage it. You may give it freakish birth defects, or whatever, some of which, seem encouraging to the evolutionists because they're changes, but they're not making a viable alternative. What you don't do is reprogram the direction. See, it gets to where it's going or it doesn't get anywhere. So I've been arguing that you can't make the big evolutionary creative changes without intelligence. It turns out you can't do it with intelligence either. At least by the mechanism, which is widely accepted. So this is how the wedge is developing in its strategy. There are many more books coming out. To read about all of this, there are 2 websites you can go to. We should have had that on the program. But one of them is www.discovery.org. Discovery.org. It's the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is a foundation which handles our money. People who've donated to this. We support a number of these people on postgraduate fellowships and all, because it's hard for them to get mainstream academic jobs. So there's a lot at their website about it's a center for the science, the reconstruction of science. No, that's not it. Anyway, it's a discovery, and there's a web page there for all of this writing and a lot of news about it. The main website, other than that, is www.arn.org. It stands for Access Research Network, just arn.org. And that has a separate page for each of these authors, including me. And it's got a lot of our articles, which you can download and read for free, and all the material about the books and tapes and so on. We really should have a book table here, but that didn't happen. But in future occasions, I'm sure we'll do that. And but you can order any of the books off the web, and you can get them also at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, Borders.com, the other book-selling websites. They're all there. So this is what is going on, you see, with the building of an intellectual movement. And what is particularly important and encouraging to me in this, we are moving against a huge power struggle. There's this tremendous unwillingness to consider the alternative, to say it's evil, and to wield weapons like the God of the Gaps historical story, and all, to say that you're trying to bring us to darkness rather than to light. So we get that kind of opposition. But, we're not really getting any opposition on the scientific merits and on the philosophical merits. Within the mainstream scientific community, there's just a lot of confusion. As I see this, they used to claim that they knew the whole story of how life originated, and the museum exhibits, like that one in New Mexico, still, do that. But the leaders now concede that they really don't know, that their theories aren't going far with that. They still cling to Neo-Darwinism, but there are many powerful voices in the scientific community that have one time or another said that it can't be true. Stephen Jay Gould, 20 years ago, was promising to have a new theory, and at that time he wrote in scientific journals that Neo-Darwinism as a general theory is effectively dead, despite its prevalence as textbook orthodoxy. One of the leading mathematical biologists recently wrote, there must be a new undiscovered law, a fourth law of thermodynamics, which produces the information. Well, see, that's just a materialist way of saying God, a new undiscovered law that produces the information. He might not like that, statement, but that's really what it is. And so, see, what we find is that gradually the realization is dawning that you can't explain things that simple materialistic way. And that's not surprising, you see, because Darwinian evolution is basically a 19th century story. And in every area of science, you find that things are enormously more complicated than you had thought. So the issue will have to be opened up. But it's terribly difficult, and in the third hour, I'm going to talk something about why it's so terribly difficult to do, what the real lines of opposition are. Now I think we could take just about, a couple of questions if people would want to go further into this. And as I say, we're going to have more. I'm going to have a briefer presentation in the third hour with more questions, because then you have the most to ask questions about.
A lot of your explanations about scientific materialism borders on this question and the notion of myth in our culture. And generally, scientists don't want to touch that, because when you challenge science as a mythological construct, you run into all these clashes. Can you talk a little bit about your work in that area of mythology and how it relates between these bridges of the scientists calling religion myth and some of the creationists calling
yes.
science myth?
Well, I think that question of myth versus, tested science, let's say, is also kind of equivalent to questions about the difference between faith and reason, you see, and story and theory and all of that. And I think the best way to understand this is that every system of thought needs a kind of foundational story. The foundational story, you can say the metaphysical foundation, is not itself a theory, that you hold open to proving and disproving. It's something you assume, and it provides the platform or the theories that you do propose and hold open to testing. And that's what I was illustrating with the two stories, the one from the book of John and the particle story, that the foundational metaphysical story that has become associated with science in the 19th and 20th centuries is the story of in the beginning were the particles and the laws. And this is a very satisfying story to many people, because first place, it sets them free from God. You see, it reduces God to a mythical kind of being in human subjectivity. It also holds open the prospect that scientific professionals can, in principle, understand everything, because the laws and the particles that they can understand. The idea of a creator, a supernatural being outside of science, threatens not the practice of science. You go on, as I say, in Newton and Galileo's day, it was the assumed story. But it threatens scientific imperialism, the view that science can explain everything. Now, I think we see the coming together of this, the myth and the theory, so particularly in the Human Genome Project and the cultural prospects of that. We've now, they are saying, uncovered the secret of life, they say. And now the basic life process, the creative process itself, can be under human control. See, this is the imperialism of the project. We can redesign people. We can make better people, whatever kind we want. Certainly people more like us than like the other fella. You see, and this is that dream of having the theory of everything that physicists have sometimes projected, although biologists are really more in love with the idea now than physicists, I think. And so that's the myth. And a myth isn't bad, and it isn't false. I mean, it may be false or it may be true, but it's a story that gives you a basis for finding the other truths. It's the life, it's the light, you see, that illuminates everything else. So one of the things I'm going to cover in the third thing is why I think that in the beginning was the word story is actually a better founding story for science as well as everything else. So thanks very much for the question. We'll get these two, and then we'll take the second break.
I think that most people would acknowledge that there are new life forms emerging today. For example, antibiotic resistance, bacteria.
Those aren't new life forms. Those are the bacteria that have always existed.
Bacteria evolve. They mutate in order to defeat
the
latest antibiotics that have been thrown at them in order to defeat the bacteria. And there are, in fact, in parts of the world, there are epidemics of tuberculosis which are spreading around the world.
Oh, yeah. All that exists. That's not controversial.
As these new bacteria evolve to defeat antibiotic regimens. So I'm just wondering, how does intelligent design and the role of God play into the evolution of new bacteria that defeat antibiotics?
Yeah, well, see, I'm going to quibble about the terminology just a bit. It isn't new bacteria. Any more than taller or shorter people are new people. It's all the same bacteria that have always existed, but bacteria, like other things, have a capacity to vary. And I think the example I used, which is fundamentally the same thing, is mosquitoes becoming resistant to DDT. It's the same thing as bacteria becoming resistant to penicillin. What happens is if you douse a population with a certain toxin, the population will vary in its susceptibility. And the most resistant individuals will be the ones that survive. And assuming this is a hereditary trait, then their descendants will inherit that. And after a time, you've got a resistant population. Penicillin doesn't work very well anymore. The likelihood is that when you remove the toxin, the population goes back to normal. Because you see, they are not superior in any general way, but merely resistant to this particular toxin. So they're often, in fact, less fit in terms of other environmental areas because they've lost some capacity. So none of this is controversial at all, and it isn't creative. It isn't. That's why I quibbled about the terminology. You say new bacteria, things like you've made something new. No, you haven't. that you've simply brought out the potential for variation that's present in populations. That's completely uncontroversial. And the question is, how do you get the bacteria in the first place? See, that's the issue that we're directed to. But nobody in the intelligent design movement, and I might say nobody in the most traditional biblical young earth creationist movement, denies or ever has denied that natural variation occurs. The basic question is within what limitations and boundaries does it occur? And of course, the scientific naturalist doctrine is there must not be any boundaries, because the process has to explain everything. So then the question is that scientific naturalist claim true?
And is there no evolution of life happening today? Did life occur? Was it developed at a certain point and then stopped?
Yeah, that's right. There is no creative evolution observed to be occurring today. There is this, phenomenon that you've described. There is this what I don't think it should be called evolution at all. It's adaptive variation. That definitely occurs. And if that is the mechanism can explain how you get bacteria and insects, mosquitoes and people for the mosquitoes to bite in the first place, well, that's the Darwinian claim, and that's what we're challenging.
So there is an intelligent design in the role of change of mosquitoes or bacteria.
Well, let me just say, there is design, chance, and the law, and they're all separable and empirically distinguishable scientifically. Now, there is the theological question, of how to interpret that. See, certainly a Christian theist would not say that God has a part only in the designed events, and the things that happen by law or whatever are not within God's providence. The theological doctrine would be that God is responsible for all of it. As far as what is empirically observable and distinguishable, you can distinguish, law, chance, and design, all of which operate in the world. So that is not something which we regard as a problem. But of course, we have to deal with the Darwinian claim, which we regard as completely false. But we have to deal with it, that the kinds of variations that are illustrated by bacteria becoming resistant to penicillin are a creative force that can explain the appearance of bacteria and all other living things in the first place. That's the fundamental point at issue. So last question, and then we'll take the second break.
First, I just wanted to thank you for coming here, and this has been really helpful. But you touched a little bit on my question, but really I was wondering, you alluded to the idea that laws will allow for some simple, repetitive events. Laws allow for, cause simple, repetitive events to occur, and this can only produce something simple and not complex. Therefore, something other than laws must be giving complexity. I think that's what you were saying. I guess I have difficulty with this argument sometimes because I don't know if you are familiar, I'm not entirely familiar, I don't know all the details, but there have been recent experiments in the biology field showing that causing random mutations in RNA can result in RNA that can actually perform enzymatic functions, sort of supporting the whole RNA world theory, which I'm not a supporter of, but I think that this would sort of point to the idea that, so you have this like so-called law, something repetitive and simple happening, and you end up with something rather complex. Yeah. And so I guess I kind of am thinking, rather than complexity pointing to design necessarily, I mean, I think it does, but in terms of arguing for that, I think, with the RNA enzymes, you can cause something to happen one way, but another entirely different question is, did it actually happen that way? So part of, I think, what I find difficult about evolution is, like the whole theory of evolution is that it's not really empirically verifiable in a very, I can't think of a way you can empirically verify it. Yeah. And so how do you address, I guess, how would you improve upon the whole idea of complexity and intelligent design to make it more stronger?
Yeah, how do we do this? Now, it's a good question. I have to say something about the RNA world in order to make this intelligible to many people. It's basically the idea. Remember that museum exhibit said volcanoes plus lightning equals DNA equals life? Well, it changes the story to say, well, DNA is too complex. You can't make that that way. But maybe RNA could be. RNA is a little simpler, and it's sort of in between DNA and proteins. Proteins, do certain functions, and DNA contains the information. RNA translates the information, carries it from the DNA to the proteins, and maybe it can carry out certain enzymatic functions. See, so that would be our best candidate for the first molecule to evolve. I mean, that's what the RNA world idea is about. It's entirely speculative. And while it has been proposed by some scientists as the most likely possibility, it's also been knocked throughout the scientific literature as completely inadequate. The discoverer of it, I understand, has said it really doesn't have anything to do, these enzymatic functions, with the origin of life. It's just something interesting about the life processes. And now, what this illustrates in a general way, I think, is if you start out with the assumption that there's got to be a material and naturalistic, start to life, then the way your logic works is that whatever is the least implausible possibility becomes true and becomes a satisfactory answer to all the objectives, all the objections. And you see, what I call this is setting the bar very low. If I want something badly to be provable, I just, make the standard of proof very easy, so that all you have to do is show that RNA has some minimal enzymatic function, and it's solved. Likewise, if you need to show the creative power of natural selection, all you need is the peppered moth. You see, the bar is set so low that anybody can get over it. It's like having a high jump contest. We'll see how well you folks high jump. We'll set the bar at 6 inches. And you'll do very well. You'll be excellent high jumpers. See, so what we do, in fact, to answer your question, is we set the bar more realistically, and we open the whole subject to investigation, you see, so that things don't have that kind of philosophical boost. And that, I think, is a way to liberate the mind. It's not a way to restrict the mind, but to consider the real nature of the problem. When that happens, the first step, what's going to happen, is that the scientific world will drop unproductive ideas like the RNA world, which are really a modern form of alchemy. You say it's really alchemy, an attempt to make impossible transformations with wild speculative ideas. And they'll realize that before you can even frame intelligent questions about how life originated, you have to have a better understanding of what it is and how it works. You see, you understand what the thing is and what it has to do before you can really frame intelligent questions about how it originated. The RNA world people and the other pre-biological evolutionist people have been assuming that life is just chemicals. Then you get the chemicals and you'll be okay. That's the setting the bar low. So what we're doing in order to make these issues more testable and so on, it's just what scientists have always done when they've been at their best. You float hypotheses, RNA world or anything else, and you test them with a full awareness of all the difficulties. Let's see. And then, now, what is so unpleasant about that is that you might discover that the problem that you're trying to solve is unsolvable by the means you're trying to solve it with. You see, and that might be such an unwelcome outcome, not, for a whole lot of reasons, including the effect on your proposals for research grants, that you might not want to recognize it. You see, so it's really just scientific research and testing. You wanted to?
So my question was not really per se regarding the RNA world, but rather, so what you're saying then is that the RNA enzymes that were produced by that experiment are not at a level of complexity that meets your criterion. Then
well, no, wait a minute. Nobody has seen RNA emerge from a prebiotic soup. Don't get that idea.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I was saying earlier is that, just because you can make something happen doesn't mean it actually did happen that way originally.
Oh, that's true.
That's definitely true. But I think, I guess what sort of concerns me about the complexity argument is that, you can see complexity coming out of what so-called laws. And I guess sort of the divorcing the laws, the reason why I said you kind of touched on this point earlier is saying that, God does govern the laws as well, so that laws actually can produce complexity, but that's under God's control.
It's specified complexity. Right? You've just changed the point totally when you say, what you're saying is complexity can't be produced by natural processes. That isn't what I said.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that isn't what the intelligent design people say.
Okay.
See that you have to go through the thing, and this is the thing. I mean, in order to do these things, in order to make the proper inquiries and to investigate, see, one of the things you have to do is define concepts specifically. What are we trying to explain? And a great enemy of proceeding with that is to use oversimplified definitions or definitions that shift. See, that's why I'm so a bit sticky about the definitions and rules and so on. I know that the evolution is always preceded by saying, well, all I have to do is show evolution. Evolution is any change. You get to mosquitoes becoming resistant to DDT, therefore we've proved evolution, and therefore we're home. So you really have to develop the terms and the specific claims about complex specified information that, that Dembski and others have made. Yeah, just to say, oh, yeah, laws can maybe produce complexity is not really investigating.
Okay, I guess I missed what you actually meant by complexity then. Could you kind of go over that again?
Put aside the word complexity and talk about books of meaningful text. Books of meaningful text. I think that's the most helpful way to start. Do laws produce those? Do they produce the arrangement of letters in a book? Does chance produce it? Hey, no. And that's why, you see, the danger to clear thinking, that's why I'm emphasizing this point, is to take something very clear and understandable like that and turn it into something that's so vague and undefined that anything might produce it. And say that in order to get good theories and good testing, you have to have very precise concepts. So thanks very much, but that's how I'd answer. So now we got another break, and then we'll have a brief talk with me and then further questions. So be thinking about your questions.